This is about agricultural origins and the Garden of Eden. And we're going to deal in the first part with the O'Brien thesis. And this essentially is what is called the Levantine Corridor hypothesis, which O'Brien had worked out in the mid-70s and put it into the book called The Genius of the Few, which was published in 1984. And so it's a summary of evidence supporting the first domestication of crops and animals in the Levantine Corridor, close to Mount Hermon in southern Lebanon. And it's Learning from History Part 14. All the other parts contribute, but this is a pulling together of all past material that I put into those Learning from History presentations, which are on YouTube. But now we're looking at a lot more detailed evidence to be able to finally convince the academics and the establishment that we have a wonderful story to tell about our brilliant and very advanced ancestors. These are the two principal books edited by Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien. One is The Genius of the Few, and the second is The Shining Ones. Now, the price of The Genius of the Few on eBay was £960 last week because we're out of stock, and the price was put on The Shining One, also on The Genius of the Few on Amazon at £3,500. Both those prices are utterly outrageous, and I hope anybody watching this video will recognise the fact that if they want these books at the correct prices, which is £24.50 and £49.50, they must go to the Golden Age Project website and not to YouTube or eBay. These are the authors in their prime, and here's part one, the O'Brien thesis. Now, the source of research. The authors of the two books shown, Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien, carried out their research over a lifetime of travelling in the oil industry and 30 years of detailed study after retirement to the North Essex countryside in 1971. Their work was based on identifying ancient surveying in Britain on the Wandlebury-Hatfield Heath Loxodrome and the Bodmin Moor Astronomical Complex. Both those two extraordinary structures were carried out by our brilliant ancestors around 2,500 BC. Ancient knowledge of astronomy and the Earth's dimensions at that time has now been proved by computerized statistical analysis, which is what the establishment wanted to even accept the whole idea. So it's there for people to look at. They followed up to identify these surveyors using a whole range of multidisciplinary skills to locate their origins. This required retranslating Bible texts, the books of Enoch, and a unique ability to translate archaic Kharsag cuneiform tablets found in the Sumerian Nippur Temple Library by the University of Pennsylvania by Professor Hayes in their excavations in 1896 to 98. Christian O'Brien was a Cambridge graduate in natural sciences in 1932 and one of the world's leading exploration geologists, fully supported by his wife Barbara Joy, a specialist in religions and religious history, and the author of The Unity of Truth, which is a very important chapter in The Genius of the Few, dealing with all religions to show how they were all connected and united originally. He died in February 2001. Edmund Marriage, that's me, and Barbara Joy continue his work. Now, the principal textual sources of what I'm going to be talking about come from the King James's Bible, which is the best attempt ever made to pull together the biblical text in English. This is around about the time that the Queen Elizabeth had a translation of the Bible in Welsh, and that the people in England, thanks to Francis Coverdale and William Tynan, actually were able to read the Bible text 1,000 years, of course, more than 1,000 years after they were first dealt with. And so you can imagine here we've got problems which need to be sorted out in terms of translation. The books of Enoch, another very important records which I'm going to come to, and most important of all are the Sumerian Kharsag tablets, which tell the history of the Sumerian people, and they were our brilliant ancestors. The first key clue and first important point about religion and history is what we're told in the Bible. The common name for God in Hebrew is Elohim, a plural form, and the common name for Elohim in English is God, a singular term. In the early Bible versions it is used in a plural context. So in the first instance we're talking about the gods plural. El is a very ancient word with a long history, and it has a common origin with many other ancient words in other languages, but with a common significant meaning: bright, shining, bright being, shining being, or shining one. On the detailed etymological analysis of the modern word God should be replaced with the plural shining ones. And the word heaven, in Hebrew Hashemin, with a plural ha and a root shem, should be replaced by planted highlands. This is O'Brien's first key points, which are there within the alternative Genesis on the Golden Age Project website for you to read and look at yourself and see how these translation mistakes were made in the first instance. When we read the books of Enoch, we have very interesting records of angels and watchers, and we have this particular subject is about agriculture and agricultural history and the domestication of crops. And we have this quote of Shemjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. And here we have the other watchers and their jobs described. Amoros, the resolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. Korkabel, the constellations. Ezekiel, the knowledge of the clouds. Arakel, the signs of the earth. Shamaziel, the signs of the sun. And Sariel was a member of the Anunnaki Council, so the watchers were fully involved in this incredibly well-organized society, and his job was to study the course of the moon. We're not really sure what enchantments were, because we have different meanings for different words at different times in history, but I think you will find that enchantments are a very serious secular subject and not in any way speculative in terms of how we interpret evidence. A key point which is well established, and I'm linking these 2 points about agriculture and the peoples of the world, and this says the similarities between Sanskrit, Latin and Greek prove that there was once a Proto-Indo-European language from which all three are descended, together with a central source from which the post-Younger Dryas agricultural civilizations evolved and diffused around planet Earth. The final key source of evidence are the 9 Kharsag tablets. The Kharsag means, and I'm going to touch on it later, but it means head enclosure. They were considered to be incantations and hymns when the first attempts of translation were made by the Reverend Professor George Barton at the Quaker Bryn Mawr College, Pennsylvania. These tablets, on closer examination, turned out to be a detailed secular record of our ancestors' arrival at the Garden of Eden site below Mount Hermon to set up an agricultural, scientific and educational settlement with 3 orders of craftsmen: archangels, angels and watchers, led by An, Enil, Enki and Ninkatsag, who are the principal Sumerian gods, and Abraham, who was the, if you like, the god or the leader of Christians, the Jewish faith and Islam. Abraham's god was An. It's very clear to make that point. And An was a real live person. Professor George Barton's translation of the Kharsag text was published in 1918 under the heading of Miscellaneous Babylonian Inscriptions. He only really covered a very small percentage of the translation, picking out the key points, and the name Kharsag was a key point he picked out accurately. And of course the real message here is that Christian O'Brien took this source material and spent a great deal of time and properly translated it by going right back to the beginning of cuneiform, which was in fact those Indo-European picture signs. That was the first written language, and we're going to see that there was another language which was called the speedy writing of Enoch, and we're going to look at that a little bit later. This is the tablet itself, and this is what the great Sumerian scholar Samuel Noah Kramer said in 1963, quite recently. To judge from the script, the Nippur cylinder, illustrated on this plate, 8383 in the Nippur collection of the University Museum, that's the University of Pennsylvania, may date as early as 2,500. We now know it's dated much earlier, probably about 3,500 to 4,000. Although copied and published by the late George Barton as early as 1918, its contents, which centre about the Sumerian air god, is called an air god, a mythical air god by most people, Enoch, and the goddess Ninhursag, are still largely unintelligible. Nevertheless, much that was known or misunderstood at that time of its publication is now gradually becoming clarified, and there is good reason to hope that in the not too distant future we'll see the better part of its contents ready for translation. And this is the role that Christian O'Brien, as a Cambridge scholar and with incredible skills and genius, was able to do, quite distinct from anybody else who has tried to do it. This mentions Enki, who was one of the four principal gods of the Sumerians, and the lady Ninkharsag, and she was known as Ninil before she married Enki. And this is a statue of the lady Ninkharsag, and she was governor of the Garden of Eden. That's why we had Kharsag onto Nin, to show that she was leader of and governor of the Garden of Eden site. So in those days women were considered to be equally important as men, no prejudices between the two. Now she's known as Mari locally, which is the name of the city. You're going to see a picture of that next. Mamar in Akkadian, Isis in Egypt, and the mother of Inanna. And here she is in the guise of the goddess of irrigation, found during excavations at Mari, which is Tel Harari, on the upper Euphrates in Syria, now on display in the Aleppo Museum, Syria, and we hope it hasn't been destroyed. Mari was a city dedicated to her around 4,500 BC. From the bowl flowed a fountain into the pool surrounding the statue, and this was in a massive 200-acre administrative complex, nothing to do with temples, an administrative complex, which were called tamens. And this is what the quote from the Kharsag epics say about this. And this is such an important point because it gives us all the clues about early agriculture. With this settlement will come prosperity. An enclosed reservoir, a water trap, should be established. The good land is full of water. Because of the water, food will be plentiful. The lady in Kharsag, Kharsag epic number 2. Translation of archaic Sumerian cuneiform recovered from the remains of the Nippur Library in 1896 that detail recorded history of the Garden of Eden in southern Lebanon, below Mount Hermon, which they called Kharsag, meaning head enclosure. Now I've repeated those points because they're so important in our story. So here she was in the middle of this town. The town was dedicated to her. This is one of the greatest ever Golden Age trading city-states, a product of a divine council appointed kingship, the laws of edicts of An and Enlil, and the brilliant social organisation of the Anunnaki. Wonderful art by Balag Balak. You can see that particular town, and I've been discussing it with Geoffrey Gale, who is a great green architect, if we can call him that, but we're looking here at a town where there was a lot of open spaces and trees, etc. And this was the same in all those city-states. They were beautifully designed and planned for a whole range of reasons, not including ability to cope with water and floods, but also to be having very nice places for the people to really enjoy the environment in which they lived. Mari was dedicated to Ninkharsag, wife of Enlil, goddess of irrigation, governor of the Garden of Eden at Kharsag, and mother of Inanna. She was also known as Serpent Lady, Mamar, Mari, and Mari was the goddess of Abbas. Also, Kali, Kodaliku, and Isis. So Kali is India, Kar is the Far East, Kodaliku is the Americas, and Isis is Egypt. So we're talking about this one team of people who restarted agriculture having their influence around the world. But it got distorted over time and distance. And you find that Kotaliku in the Americas was a great big basalt statue of somebody dreadful who was tearing people's hearts out. So that's what people, we the people, did to our wonderful gods, who were totally benevolent. Mari was founded about 4,500 BC in contemporary with Uruk, which is further down the Euphrates, together with cities in the Jordan Valley and Kana'an, or Canaan. And with and Mari had over 200 craft trades and guilds. They were formally recorded before 3000 BC. And all the great Golden Age city-states were run by craftsmen, and people knew exactly what their various roles were. And this is a key part of their social organisation and how they managed to produce such fantastic results from what they did. The above depiction, the picture I showed you there, the above depiction is of Mari in its prime, possibly before the Kofels commentary impacts over the Austrian Alps in 3129 BC, and certainly before the commentary impacts across the region in 2345 BC. The first of these global devastations brought an end to the great city of Uruk, with the second bringing the Golden Age to an end in this area, accompanied by climate change moving monsoon rains south, leading to the desiccation of the Sahara, the Arabian, and the Thar desert areas. Because the Thar desert is in India and the Indus Valley. And we see a complete collapse of the Indus Valley cities, wonderful cities, very similar to Mari, because of this tremendous change in climate and desiccation, which took place certainly following that second commentary impact spell of 2345 BC. I put this together because it sums up in simple language for people what we should be looking for in our government of every country in the world. Once upon a time, in the civilised world, the monarch and public servants who honoured their oath of allegiance delivered to the people freedom, justice, leisure and instruction. By facilitating instruction and apprenticeship, the city-state encouraged each individual to develop special skills appropriate to the ascribed natural or genetic abilities of that individual to meet the many needs of the wider community. The pursuit of excellence in each department was a matter of honour, where self-interest led to a duty of care towards fellow citizens and the overall success of that community. Sums up, I think, very neatly what we should be trying to achieve today. Now, Plato insisted that democracy always leads to debt, bankruptcy and chaos. This is exactly where we are today on the planet. Democracy has led us into debt, bankruptcy and chaos, and we haven't really seen the worst of it by any means yet. And I would add in here, insert something I mentioned on Friday on the Where Does the Road Go program in New York, and that is that Mark Twain made the point that 10% of the people think, 10% think they think, and 80% would die rather than think. So the concept of good government is getting the very best people and put them in charge so that they solve problems. Kingship, as originally defined and practiced by the Anunnaki, prevented the destructive religious, political and scientific divisions currently destroying quality of life on this planet. The British Constitution and rule of law of 1688 to 89 comes closest to the successful ancient model of good government, but has been abandoned by self-serving politicians without the consent of the people. That English Constitution, or British Constitution, was adopted by America, all the Commonwealth countries, and even Ho Chi Minh thought it was good enough to include in his constitution for North Vietnam. Very, very important points. And the basic principles there, which we're not taught in school and should be, is that there should be a balance between the Crown, the Lords and the Commons. The Crown is all those people who work for the state, policemen, doctors, nurses, army, and all the rest of it. particularly the lawyers. They should swear an oath of allegiance to the Crown to do their job for the people. And that is a contract between the Crown and the people. This is what is enshrined in that fantastic constitution. The second part is the Lords, which may seem outdated, but at least we did, when we had 700 Lords, we always found people with the best knowledge of a very wide range of subjects. And now it's been politicised, and we have a problem because the Lords has so many political appointees, it simply can't function at all. So all the powers of the Crown, the Lords, have been passed to the Commons. And what have the Commons done with all those powers? They've transferred it to the European Union. And we can't even have a vote in the EU to be able to make decisions about the future of this country. That is how serious the situation is. And this is why everybody is so unhappy, and why we've got a major movement of the people who want to change politics, get our constitution back, run our country properly, so that we can show, particularly Europe and the rest of the world, what they should be doing, and to avert chaos without having to fight any more wars. Now, the Sumerian history of their and our brilliant and benevolent ancestors was placed in their libraries. And thank God for the clay tablets, which was soft clay on which a reed was used to write the cuneiform. They survived till today. And they had many attempts to destroy them and set fire and all the rest of it, and they were stuck in museum libraries with nobody able to translate it. And I think we're told, our children when they go to school aren't even told about Sumerian history in these records. But this is the summary of what I've already said, is that our ancestors who survived the global cataclysm of 10,850 BC and the Great Younger Dryas Ice Age, restart agriculture and civilization at Kharsag, below Mount Hermon in southern Lebanon. Lots of people know this, but here's one example, which is Dionysius of Susiana, which is Susa, when Jesus was 10 years old, and he wrote this: "Upon the Tyrennean Sea the people live who style themselves Phoenicians. These were the first great founders of the world, founders of cities and mighty states, who showed a path through seas before unknown, in the first ages, when the sons of men knew not which way to turn them. They assigned to each his first department. They bestowed of land a portion, of sea a lot, and sent each wandering tribe far off to share a different soil and climate. Hence arose the great diversity so plainly seen, mid nations widely severed." So this is a city-state system. And when you get an overcrowded city, you pick a young man who's done 20 years training to be a king, you pick the best man for the job, and he takes off representatives of all the 200 crafts, trades and skills in your town, and all of you have a massive exodus, and they go and start another city-state somewhere else. And this is what the Anunnaki designed and organised so that the city-state system worked really efficiently. What is important about Susiana's comments here, he mentions the Tyrennean Sea, and the Tyrennean Sea is his name at that time for the Syrian Sea, Syria being dominant at AD 3. That's also, of course, the Tyrennean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, which we call this. So we're talking about the Mediterranean Sea in modern language terms. In his poem, he says, to each his first department they bestowed of land a portion and sea a lot. Of land a portion was very important because when people migrated from this area with the city-states and to set up new city-states and to travel abroad, they were allocated between 3 and 5 acres of land to feed their families, and that was given to them by the administrators of the places they went to. And this is particularly true in Britain, where we have better records than almost anywhere else of how well the world was organised under the Druids up to the time of the Roman invasions. Very important. The titles of the 9 tablets, which O'Brien, his translation, was first the decision to settle, second the arrival of the Anunnaki, the romance of Enlil and Ninil, the planning of the cultivation, the building of the settlement, the Great House of Enil, the cold winter storm, the 1,000-year storm, and the destruction of Kharsag. Now this reads like a book. It's there for you to see on the Golden Age Project website, and is laid out in Learning from History Part 10, including the museum numbers of all the tablets. But one can check these out for yourself and have a look. The site of the Garden of Eden was here in the Levantine Corridor. Now, Syria and Lebanon here, at the top we have Syria, and then Lebanon by those Lebanese mountains which are covered in snow, right down to the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea. And it takes in the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And this is the really important area which is called the Levantine Corridor. The highlands of the snow-capped Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains of up to 9,800 feet, divided by the Bekaa Rif Valley, which runs down into the lowlands of the Jordan Valley to the Dead Sea at Jericho, where it is 670 feet below sea level. This was a glacial refuge for plants and animals. Here is a map of the area of southern Lebanon and the location of the Rishaya. It's sometimes called the Ahia Basin because the town of Rishaya is on the south side and Ahia is on the north side of the basin. And this is the site of Kharsag, and you can see it on the red dot in the middle of the screen, or the image here, the map. Now it was known much later as the Garden of Eden, and also you can see the proximity on this map to Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Damascus and Baalbek. Damascus is on the right, and you can see that Damascus, the correct name for Damascus in Arabic is Shams, and that is Shamesh. So Damascus was named after Shamesh, who was one of the Shining Ones, one of the original Shining Ones, who was in charge of the law. Baalbek is towards north of Damascus, and that's where we have magnificent buildings in Roman times, and very much earlier Itel, which is covered by these massive stones. But that's really another lecture, and I've dealt with that in other learning from history presentations. The important points here are Sidon, which was a great centre of trade for the Phoenicians from very early times. And you can see what looks like an island. There it is. It was a much longer island, and the ships could come in on any side of that, depending on the tides, the wind conditions, etc. So they were always able to anchor their ships and bring their goods into the town. And as they were great seafaring peoples, and they clearly travelled the world. Tyre is the same, and you can see the remains of land on either side of that promontory. That causeway linking the actual mainland to the island has been filled in. It was built by Alexander the Great, so he could steal all the precious goods that the people in Tyre had stored on that island. And the same picture, it was originally a long island where boats could come in from either direction and have shelter, so it made the docking of ships and unloading of ships very, very efficient. Not that long after the port of Caesarea was built by the Romans, we had a massive landslide from the Etna volcano in Sicily, which sent a tsunami right down to the eastern Mediterranean, which totally destroyed the Roman port of Caesarea and would have done tremendous damage to the original Tyre landscape and also the Sidon landscape of their port. And maybe there were many more going back 10,000 years of these tsunamis which created massive problems and reshaped the coastline. This is a galley from the area known in the early Bronze Age as Kana'an on the Tyrennean Sea. Now the settlement of the Anunnaki, and I just make a point about the Anunnaki here, a lot of people use the word Anunnaki. That is the wrong translation of the cuneiform. Anunnaki means the sons of the god An, which referred to all the subsequent generations of the god An. Anunnaki was a mistranslation by the Cambridge scholars in the early, before the real understanding of cuneiform became known, and was used by Sitchin. Now, the settlement of the Anunnaki was indicated by the above ideograms, which had a phonetic value of Kharsag or Kharsag, and appear to mean either the principal fenced enclosure or lofty fenced enclosure. Both translations are valid. The Anunnaki were the Sumerian equivalents of the biblical angels. Only after they had disappeared from the Middle Eastern scene were they worshipped in a religious sense, and they were then so enveloped in supernatural trappings that their intrinsic, advanced and benevolent characteristics were swamped in a morass of pseudo-religious adulation. That's a statement by Christian O'Brien, and it tells you how he felt about the situation quite clearly when he wrote the books. On that sign, Kharsag, you see in the middle of that sign those three arrows. That indicated irrigation. And we're going to come back to the real meaning of these cuneiform signs a bit later when we look at the description of the Garden of Eden in the Bible. Here is the perpetual snow of Mount Hermon as seen from Mount Bentol in Israel across the Bekaa Rift Valley. This is the environs of the Archaic Basin, which is page 314 in the Genius of the Few. And Mount Hermon in Arabic is, in fact, the chief mountain of the chief and snowy mountain. In the Arabic records, the Garden of Eden is 25 miles from Damascus, which is exactly where this basin is. So if we look at the Quran and we look at all the ancient literature, they're telling the same story. The havens here, black dots on this image, and there's a legend below, are those recorded in the Chronicles of Enoch, which describe in detail Enoch's journey to meet the great Lord. And the first haven is Enoch's landing place, first overnight stop, first view of the garden, place of machinery, noise and lights, prison of Brigand, building of knowledge, and the great house. And the arrow shows his route when he was taken down to meet the great Lord and look at the whole settlement by two very tall angels. A more detailed French Ordnance Survey map, which O'Brien fills in with all the features mentioned in the ancient text. We have the reservoir, we have a great house on top of a hill which overlooks the northern basin and the southern basin. We have houses, domestication, we have watercourse, we have a granary, and he's put in the various features that are in the text, and we can see when we get to the real photographs a lot more about that. But what he showed very accurately was the position of the watercourse, just following the contours, because he hadn't been able to go to Lebanon, because for 30 or 40 years it's been almost impossible for archaeologists to do any work there, which is one of the tragedies of the story I'm telling you here, because the site has been badly damaged and no real archaeological research has been done in this area in the last 100 years, which is very sad. That is our picture. We went, Carl Guilford and Paul Bedson went to Lebanon, and this is Carl's picture looking west across the basin. It's actually a flat Archaic basin looking west, but it's just a fisheye effect. A wonderful picture taken by Carl. This was my first view when Google finally got to showing images of this area. And having read the O'Brien book and being familiar with all the material, I couldn't believe it, but there was on the ground, on the overhead pictures, a very clear indication of the remains of the Great Watercourse. Same again here. There are probably very large roundhouses there on the left, and another canal or watercourse coming in, which would have brought water from the surplus water from the northern basin. Looking east back towards the suggested dam, this particular time when these images were taken, it was flooded, regularly flooded, and the whole system of waterworks and control, which originally existed from 9,500 to 6,500 BC, they were all effectively destroyed by a massive storm in 6,500. but they were so substantial and significant that the remains are there to clearly see. Here is an image of the eastern end of the watercourse, and you can see what's happening here is a bulldozer is bulldozing the banks of the Great Watercourse to create plantations of fruit trees. And then they've left a section of the watercourse to collect water, which they can use then to water the trees that they've planted, making use of the ancient resources, but of course destroying them at the same time. And the banks of the watercourse can be very clearly seen in that very yellow-coloured silt on the two banks. But that is what they did. They cut through the solid limestone a very large wide ditch, about 9 metres wide, for 1.5 miles through the cast limestone, to take all the surplus water, flood water, meltwater, times when there was too much water coming down and they needed to keep the basin dry. Then they had to build that watercourse. This is what the Bible says in Genesis 2:8-14. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. Now eastward, they always use this word, but it was eastward of where the Anunnaki came from. And the Egyptians tell us the Anunnaki came from an area on the site of the Azores, which is a separate subject. And there they put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, from whence it was parted and became 4 heads. Now here we have a big problem of translation, because the Bible really came originally from cuneiform, then into Aramaic, then into Archaic Hebrew, and then into the Hebrew of Ezra when Ezra wrote the Bible, and then into Greek, and then Greek to Latin, Latin to English. And it didn't take much common sense to see that an awful lot of the material was very much distorted on the way with all the different translations. But what it should have said, and they should have recognised from the cuneiform, the intricacies is telling you whether it was a watercourse or a river, a canal or whatever, which is a descriptive view of that water item. And so it should have read, and a watercourse went out of Eden to water the garden, from whence it was parted with sluices and became into 4 heads, which are irrigation channels. Now you have the names here, Basin, Gihon, Hedikel. It's very important to see that they originally named the watercourse and particularly the irrigation channels with particular names, as farmers would do today if they were irrigating farmland, to know when they sent somebody down to clean it out or open the sluice, they give them a name of which watercourse it was. And clearly those names were used much later times for other rivers. This is an overhead view of the valley below Kar-Uf, which is really the Eden village up on the hill, and we can look down into the valley there, and if we actually look across the mouth of the valley, we can actually see some dark patches, which may be where the dam was, over here. But this needs an archaeological investigation, and we know we're going to find loads of big blocks at the foundations of the buildings in the village. The watercourse here runs there. There's another situation of orchards being planted on the watercourse, which is being filled in, a gap which collects water, and if you look from the left and centre left right the way through to the far distance, you'll find the watercourse running and eventually heading for the Wadi Nirab, where it empties, or did empty, any surplus water into the river Hispani. And the Hispani is at the headwaters of the Jordan River. So anybody living in the Jordan Valley, their gods literally lived right at the top of the watershed of the water coming down from the Lebanese mountains. We have some clues here. We have this description here of the celestial abode of the gods was Enel's great cedar and stone-built mountain house below and west of Mount Hermon, the meeting place of the divine council, where the Anunnaki based their headquarters, until moving to Baalbek at the head of the 2 rivers, which were the Litani and the Orontes, not the Tigris and Euphrates. And this is this wonderful story of Enoch on his visit to meet the great Lord, and he has been taken up by 2 very tall angels who are wearing some kind of reflectant paste, so they look very, very frightening. rather like Shane Moore puts the ointment on his nose, or used to when he was bowling, to stop the stun burning it. Anyway, here's the story. Then the Lord said to Michael, take Enoch, and strip him of his own clothes, anoint him with fine oil, and dress him like ourselves. And Michael did as he was told. He stripped me of my clothes, and rubbed me over with a wonderful oil like dew, with the scent of myrrh, which shone like a sunbeam. I looked at myself, and I was like one of the others. There was no difference, and all my fear and trembling left me. Then the Lord asked one of his archangels, named Uriel, who is Enki, that was the name for Enki, who was the most learned of them all, and said, bring out the books from my library, and give Enoch a pen for speedy writing, and tell him what the books are about. And Uriel hurried and brought me the books, smelling of myrrh, and handed me a pen. Now the great Lord here is An. We have Enki, and Enel's obviously not far away. The sincerity of this account is quite remarkable. There are no heroics, no bombast, just an honest statement of his human frailty in the face of what must have been a most terrifying experience. The parallel Sumerian account shows that this building to which Enoch had been brought was the large, brilliant, cedarwood building on the high rock, the great house of Enel, the E-Kur. Now the speedy writing of Enoch was the alphabet, or alphabet, and the alphabet goes right back to the very earliest times, and the alphabetic texts were used in-house by the administrators. They did thought that they shouldn't let the ordinary people learn to write and read at that time, in case it led to trouble later. Same sort of problem as we have today, I might add. But what they did do is they gave the ordinary people the pictorial text, the picture language, and I'm going to come to that later, because that was a spatial language which everybody could learn quickly. They didn't have to learn to read and write, they could learn the pictorial language terribly quickly. So you might have thought they were taking things away from the people. They weren't. They gave the people what the people needed was something much simpler. Like what we do when we drive across Europe, where we have spatial signs to tell us when to turn right, left, stop, go slow, all the rest of it. Here on the ground, from the Google image, is the Great House, the site of it and the outline of it. The main part of the Great House is in the nose of what looks like a dog. And it would have been seen like that from the air, and would have had a wall around it, and the wall around it gave it the name of paradise, because paradise means a walled garden, and the original paradise was a walled garden right here. The great cedar-built house within the sanctuary, the lofty enclosure perched on the high rock. The site of Enel's great cedar-built house and enclosure on the high rock. Various descriptions from the ancient texts are clear in providing the evidence that we are looking here at the E-Kur mountain house, where the gods lived and divine decrees were given, kingship was exercised, and from which the cosmic waters of fertility flowed. Descriptions of the great cedar-built house within the sanctuary were the building of stone fireplaces, and where Adam and Eve spoke to the serpent, all help to support the O'Brien thesis that this is the site of the Garden of Eden. It's a flat-topped hill, very high up, with wonderful views over the north and south Brishire basins. And we'll see the views in a minute. What Eve was talking to in the garden was not a snake, it was a serpent. And the word serpent was one of the most important words in our history, because it meant wise man or woman. Wise as a serpent from the Bible, you'll find that. The serpent was later thought to be the most important animal, and they've all got their words mixed up. And then we have reptilians and every silly story leading on from the fact that they misunderstood what the original word serpent meant. And the serpents were two-eyed serpents if they were archangels, one-eyed serpents if they were angels, and they were watchers, were observant. And we have all those images of the four-faced person looking in four directions at the same time, giving an indication of what they thought of somebody who was a genius. This is the current situation, and the red in the middle of there is where the great house was, and I've said here current critical area for protection on top of the central flat top hill, and this is taken in 2010. There are two new buildings next to the central enclosure, and this shows risk from urbanisation. I think there are 4 houses on there now. So our most important site in the world is being developed. I don't think it would happen in England. All round the top of that hill, they bulldozed the remains of the great house, and they must be ancient remains because of their size and the quality of the stonework for all the fittings for the fireplaces, the door lintels, and the doors, and all the other features. That's one example. That's a second example. And you can see behind a whole row of big stones which have been bulldozed from the site and left around the outside of the site. So a lot of them have been removed for building materials for the local people. That is the view from the Great House. So sitting in the Great House, looking out of the window, you would have a fantastic view of the basin, which you can see there. And what you're looking in the foreground is a fantastic, very fertile, south-facing slope, which would have been perfect at that time for getting all the sun. And that's where the orchards, the vineyards, the trees, and the livestock, and all the farming operations would have been carried out, apart from the grain, which would have been grown in the basin below. So you can see the whole thing is much, much larger than our small minds have thought the Garden of Eden was. What we have on this image is a well, which you can see middle halfway down, which we're going to look at in a minute, where there was a constant water supply, and still is. The locals say it's never changed, it's very deep, and we don't know how it's constructed, but it's cleverly constructed. The hydraulic system is still in place, and here it is. Hillside well above what we believe were the livestock buildings. Beautiful clear water. Another image lower down, and you can see more clearly the basin and a possible site of livestock buildings. An even more interesting picture showing the dead level flat base of that lake. In the distance is a fig tree, the only bit of vegetation left, and the great house is top left. There's a few rocks being pushed out, which doesn't make it look quite a flat top hill, but it is, and that's top left. And on the right hand side we're getting close to Ka'uf, where we're looking for the building of knowledge. Fig tree, and you can see how fertile that soil is. It's still being cultivated all the way up that slope, and it's a fantastic, as I say, south-facing slope which farmers love, particularly if you're growing all the exotic crops. And the whole area is famous for the Lebanon cedars. This is a remaining cedar grove, well watered by snowmelt water till midsummer. The key point here is that those mountains are regularly receiving snow every year and have done for 10,000 years. And that snow takes a long while to melt. It's 9,000 feet high. And that snowmelt water was critical to the operations which they wanted to carry out in the Garden of Eden site, and are still critical today for growing really good quality cedar trees. A very important point and very important clue as to the agricultural values of this particular location. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the cedar forest was visited by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Enkidu is said to have killed the giant Hawara, who guarded the forest for the Anunnaki. Both spoke to the keeper of the gate at the entrance of the Garden of the Gods. In many ancient texts, including the Arabic texts, it's still regarded as the Garden of the Gods. Roman Emperor Hadrian, one of the most informed emperors in Rome, brought strict laws in to protect the Lebanon cedars. And Hadrian did something else which was very interesting. He built that wonderful building in Rome, the Pantheon, which is dedicated to these gods that I'm talking about. Romans had absolutely no doubt who had delivered everything. It was the gods. The Assyrians were the same, and all the ancient peoples knew how important the gods were. That's why the gods were worshipped, if you like, and regarded with so much respect, right up to the time when people started calling the gods mythical and gods heathen. Cedar Cones, lovely picture. Here there's a functioning well in the centre of the flat basin. Close up on that, very deep, beautiful fresh water, still there. Here is what is described by the locals as the cave, which in fact is a sinkhole, and it's the outlet to the basin. The water table in the 1,300-acre basin could be controlled at this point, where underground streams had found their way through the porous cast limestone. And there's a major stream going down here. They put dye to follow its course and ended up in the Hisbari River about 5 miles away. But that was the way in which they were able, using very simple devices, to control the level of the water table in that enormous basin. This image features on the north slope of the basin, where another watercourse seems to merge with the Great Watercourse, probably intended to bring additional water for some irrigation from the northern basin or prevent it from flooding of the southern basin. There are clearly what look like roundhouses. They've all been bulldozed flat by the locals now, and the whole of that very interesting area has been filled in to grow orchards. Another massive problem for recording the genuine archaeology of the site. This is an overhead of the key area of activity, which joins the great house, which you can just see the dog's head on the left, top left, and then we run across to where we have settlements and evidence of human activity, and these look to be very much like the site for the building of knowledge, which is described in the ancient text, and the centre of Kar-Uf. Just going to blow this up again now. That's Kar-Uf, and we're looking at that circular area in the middle left, which we saw on this one, and we've got these are the areas where we would like to carry out detailed archaeological investigations and hope to find a lot of intact material to give us the clues of the past. That's a blow-up of the one I've been mentioning on the left of Kar-Uf to the west of Kar-Uf. Obviously something interesting was happening there at that very interesting site. And this is the centre of Kar-Uf, where we know there are very large stones and all manner of items which look very, very ancient. This is running down to the watercourse. You can see the watercourse at the bottom. There's a section there that hasn't been filled in. This is a quanat, and that may have been put in much later, but it's probably one of the earliest quanats we have records of, down to the Great Watercourse, southwest of Kar-Uf. And this is the quanat as a mother well, access shaft, quanat channel, and it's really to intersect water which would otherwise go deep down, and that's the kind of water they wanted for the irrigated land. The steep valley to the east and below Kar-Uf joins the watercourse and takes water from the western flanks of the Mount Hermon range. The cuneiform and Enochian records confirm that a dam was built here to create a reservoir. Here is the valley. It's very heavily eroded now, cut deep in the bottom of that valley as one would expect. And this is, Brown calculated that there were more than 50 acres were available here to provide water for irrigation by looking at all the contours up this valley. And so going back on using levels, it's on the Ordnance Survey maps, it was fairly straightforward to calculate approximately how much water it would have stored. And so that 50 acres would have been provided enough water to irrigate the basin and the areas on the side of the hill during the dry summer months, from about July onwards, when the snow had stopped melting. The only feature which might possibly have provided an overflow or water diversion mechanism at the base of the original dam looks as though we're taking water off, and this may be where the water went to power the machinery and lights which are described by Enoch. Great sophistication at that time, possibly. And if we go down that tunnel, we'll know whether there's any truth in the idea that that's what it was used for. But clearly a large wooden sluice, a cedar sluice, could have dropped over that hole to block it off, and you would have lifted it to be able to let the water out of the dam, or divert the water from the dam. These are very interesting images given us by the local people who are the Druze. They all know about the importance of this site in history, but it's like all history, been garbled. We've had terrific responses from some of the locals, and we're trying to get proper archaeological investigation to be carried out by the Lebanese authorities. But this particular picture shows water coming up, and it's replacing the snow. So this groundwater is coming up and melting the snow, which is a clue that we've got a waterworks system here. The original waterworks system to feed those 3 wells is still in place. And this would be part of any archaeological excavation to find out exactly how they managed to control the level of the water table. Another image, you can see clearly the water coming out from the centre well and spreading out, and is dead flat. More clues. And I've said here, image of the Archaic Basin under snow, showing points where water is coming to the surface from wells. Both in Genesis and the Quran on the Garden of Eden, it actually states water welling up from the ground. The word abzu, which is used for the Garden of the Gods, actually means underground waters, or I believe a slightly better translation is the farmer's waters, because ab can either be farmer or father, depending on the context. And as a former farmer, it seems to me that this is well described. The Absu actually described as the farmer's waters. And this was what was so precious for the whole system to survive for something like 3,000 years. This is an extract from the Sumerian Farmer's Almanac. The writer of the Sumerian Farmer's Almanac said that the agricultural instructions were not his. They were those of the god Ninurta, the son and true farmer of the leading Sumerian deity Enlil. This translation of the first 18 lines has been done by Benno Landsberger and the famous Thorsgilds Jacobsen, and the cuneiformists at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. I'm not going to read it all, because you can do that in your own time, but it says here, in the days of yore, a farmer gave these instructions to his son. When you are about to cultivate your field, take care to open the irrigation works so that the water does not rise too high in the field. And anybody who farms knows that controlling the level of the water table is absolutely essential to good farming. Too high, you lose your crops. Too low, you lose your crops. And you find the same thing with the plant on your windowsill if you've forgotten to water it or give it too much. Basic fundamentals which are crucial before any kind of successful farming can operate efficiently. We now in this country have the good fortune of draining our soil and being able to rely on a good rainfall. But here at this time they couldn't do that. So in red is the flow from the Rashah Basin to the Hisbani River, and that's in red, and the Hisbani is in blue, and that goes down to the Jordan. So we're looking here at the headwaters of the Jordan, and of course the water flowing down from here to Israel and Palestine, and even further down to Jordan, is of massive importance to the future of those countries, as it is in America to have enough water in California to farm. And they've had the driest period for so long this year. So the gods chose the Bekaa Valley between the snow-capped mountains of Lebanon, close to Mount Hermon, on a south-facing slope where there was a good supply of snow-melt water, fertile soil, and an ideal location for irrigation agriculture on a lake bed which they had drained. During the Younger Dryas Ice Age, this area was a glacial refuge for the important wild grasses, the oak, cedar, pistachio and olive, and also a lot of the wild animals. At the beginning of the Holocene, in 9400 BC, it shows a perfect site for a restart for agriculture. Another little clue to support my arguments made so far as Manu's cache of seed. And you can see Manu is very similar to An. It's called Anu in Akkadian, An in the original text, and Manu when we get to the Indus Valley and Indian history. And the legends of Manu's cache of seeds with Iran's northwest tale of Iriana Rejo, if I pronounced that correctly. If I haven't, I apologise to all those concerned. Ahura Mazda warns of Yima, the first king of men, and the approach of a dire winter, which is to destroy every living creature by covering the land with a thick sheet of ice, and advises Yima to build a vara, or an enclosure, to preserve the seed of every kind of animal and plant. The meeting is said to have taken place in the Irana Rejo, or paradise, which means walled garden of the Iranians. And you can bet your life that the paradise or walled garden of the Iranians was this Kharsag site. And maybe this great house of Enoch went back through the Younger Dryas and was a repository, a safe repository for seeds during the Younger Dryas Ice Age. It's something we actually have to think of as a possibility. Another clue, spelt wheat. And this is really an introduction to the second part where I deal in detail with the domestication of agriculture, all the crops, all the places, all the people who support the Levantine thesis and in effect support what I'm saying. But this is about spelt. Now some of you eat spelt, I know, and make bread from spelt. But spelt is a hard-grained type of wheat, poses a great mystery. It is an unusual mixture of botanic genes, neither a development from one genetic source nor a mutation from one source. It is definitely the result of mixing the genes of several plants. Modern scholars have no answers to why the mountainous circle of the ancient Near East became a continuous source of new varieties of cereals, plants, trees, fruits, vegetables, and domesticated animals. However, the Ubaidians and the Sumerians knew the answer. The seeds, they said, were a gift sent to earth by An or Anu or Inanna from the celestial abode. An ancient text of Ur state, wheat, barley and hemp were lowered to earth along with kingship. So we have two really super comments from the history books to confirm and support all that I'm saying. So now we end that first section, and I hope you'll come back and look at part 2, because I think it's probably best to break this particular lecture into 2 parts for YouTube. Thank you for listening so far.